Welcome everyone to the latest episode of a series I like to call History Speaks. Now, on this week's show, I'm delighted to welcome a lady who is an archaeologist and historian with a particular interest in women's history. She's written many articles for various publications, including The New Scientist and Nautilus. Rebecca is also involved in a highly popular Substack site, The Tudor Notebook, and today we're going to be talking about certain characters who really do have a fascinating story to tell from the Tudor period. So please welcome my guest this week, Rebecca Batley. Hi, Rebecca. How are you?
Hi, John. I'm good, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
It's an absolute pleasure. And to start with, I've already interviewed a good friend of yours, Amy.
Amy is awesome.
She is. And as I like to do on these occasions, is to kind of break the ice. But in your case, I think to break the rubble, because many people won't know about your archaeology background. So I was wondering if you could tell us which site you've visited and possibly worked on is your favourite.
Oh, that is a question I always get asked, and it's always a very difficult one to answer as well. I would probably have to say I excavated in Ireland many years ago. And we excavated something called a souterrain. I'm not sure if you know what that is.
No, I've never heard of it.
It's basically an underground sort of storage chamber that would have been used to store a lot of food and goods and things, well, amongst other things. And excavated one of those and found a lot of human remains on the site. There had obviously been a big fight, for want of a better word, at some point in the past. And that was a particularly interesting site because it was out near Waterford, because it was very immediate. There was a lot of damage to the skeletons. We could put together the stories of the people who had died there to a good extent, where they'd come from and how they'd died, which was incredibly fascinating. And I was lucky enough to work on that for about 6 months.
What sort of time period were we looking at then for that particular excavation?
You're looking at the arrival of the Vikings. So they would have likely been attacked by Viking raiders coming into Waterford.
I must say, programmes like Time Team have really brought archaeology to the lives of many people over its run on TV and now, of course, on YouTube. And it's a fascinating insight into history, one that really digs up the past and produces some amazing stories like the one you've just told us there.
It does, and I think that's why archaeology is so fascinating, because it tells stories that can't be told any other way. So again, I sort of vaguely specialise in the excavation of human remains. So again, I was excavating down near Margate, on a Romano-British site. So we're looking at the end of the Iron Age, the early Roman period. And she had been shot in the pelvis with an arrow, which is very strange because the time period, the weaponry, it was all wrong. So we had good fun trying to untangle that one. But those people and those stories, there's no other way to reach them. There's no written records. But their bones do have stories to tell.
It's another conversation, this completely, isn't it? I could talk about this for an hour at least because it's so fascinating.
Yeah.
But today, we're not going to be talking about that. So, but it is still fascinating. And I'd love to.
It is.
I'd love to maybe talk about it another time. So let's get on to your questions then. So how did you first become interested in history? And what, in fact, is your background?
I've never not been interested in history, which always seems like a very dull answer. But I've just always been fascinated by it. So as a child, I would read as many books about it as I could, would visit a lot of places. Again, living in England, we're lucky enough to have about 1 billion historical sites on our doorstep. You can't move for them. So, yeah, So obviously I decided to make that my career. I went to university, I studied archaeology, worked as an archaeologist, and then got into the sort of writing side of it, because while it's great to uncover all these stories, not many people sit down and read an archaeological report, least of all me, if I can help it. They can be really, really dull sometimes. So I was asked by various publications to start writing some articles to try and bring a few sort of forgotten stories to a wider audience, which is how I sort of got round to writing.
So was the Tudors then, is that a specific area that you've kind of always looked at?
The Tudors are always fascinating. And I've been fascinated by them since I picked up my first book about Anne Boleyn, a children's book, I think, when I was probably about 5. Yeah, they're always fascinating. But I suppose I came round to this particular Tudor subject because I was looking at forgotten women. So I'm looking at women's history, women whose stories aren't widely told. And if they are told, they're not told correctly.
It is.
Yeah,
Sorry, go on.
No, go ahead.
I'm going to say it is. My thing is that I always think women's stories are far more fascinating than the men, and from whichever period of time you want to look back on. So yeah, I think you're quite right in saying that the women's history, and the women are generally forgotten, aren't they?
They are, yeah. I mean, I suppose Tudor women are quite lucky in a sense, in that they are less forgotten than women from other periods of history, simply because of the 6 wives of Henry VIII. But all the women around them, their stories aren't very often told. And as I said, if they are told, they're not told correctly, or history has done a bit of a number on them, as is the case with both women we're about to talk about. History and the rumours around them have rather obscured the reality of their story, which is almost worse, I guess, than being forgotten entirely.
Well, today we're going to be talking about certain characters. You've not mentioned them yet, but we will get to them from the Tudor period. In particular, to start with, Edward Seymour. Now, what do we know about Edward's rise at court? How did he go from a knight to a Duke of Somerset, and then eventually Lord Protector?
Ambition, mostly. I think Edward Seymour was very, very ambitious. He was born in about 1500, and he was the son of John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth. So the Seymours were a well-established, noble family. And his father was a man on the rise. He was fairly popular at the court of Henry VIII. He was too old to be one of Henry's sort of closest confidants. But as he achieved success at the court, obviously his son was exposed to opportunities that he wouldn't otherwise have had. It's worth noting, actually, that Edward Seymour was originally the Seymour Spare. He did have an older brother, John, who died in his teens. But by the age of 14, Edward Seymour had come to Henry VIII's attention, and he was appointed as a page of honour to accompany the king's sister Mary to France when she married Louis XII, which, as we know, did not go particularly well. After which he returned to England to resume his education. We think he went to Oxford, where he would have obviously been educated in theology, the classics, etc., but he didn't obtain his degree. There doesn't appear to be any evidence of that. So it seems like he left Oxford in order to rejoin the court, where there was real opportunity for advancement. By 1516, he was in the king's privy chamber. Again, he's quite young, but he's a rising star. By 1521, he finds himself in Cardinal Wolsey's household, and he's sent abroad, probably for the first time, where he's sent to the Habsburg court to be Wolsey's eyes and ears at the court of Charles V and at the Imperial Diet at Worms, where Martin Luther himself was summoned to speak. And this, I mean, for our later story, this is important because this is where he first encounters the real Reformation, its ideas and it in action, if you like. A couple of years later, he's found in France again, visiting Francis I's court when Wolsey is sent there as Henry's representative. And then, of course, he continues until his sister catches the eye of the king. We'll talk about that again in a minute, but as a consequence, of course, he finds himself as brother-in-law to the king. He becomes Viscount Beauchamp, then Earl of Hertford. Later, when Henry dies, by then he's well established at the court as sort of a powerful man, and he has very powerful connections, notably with William Paget. They form a bit of a dynamic duo, I guess, in order to hold on to power and get their own way, really. And then when Henry dies, against Henry's wishes that the rule of the minority sort of regency for Edward VI should be shared out equally among men, Seymour becomes Lord Protector and then Duke of Somerset. Realistically, the most powerful man in the kingdom.
It is remarkable how quickly fortunes could rise at court, especially in such a volatile political climate. Now, with influence, of course, wasn't built in isolation, and family ties often played a key role in shaping those paths to power. How important was his relationship with his sister Jane Seymour in securing power under Henry VIII?
That's quite a difficult question to answer. Traditionally, by later historians who have sought to blacken the name of Anne Stanhope, Edward's second wife, have sort of said that she and Edward threw Jane into the path of the king and coached her as to how to best appeal to him. There's actually not a huge amount of evidence for that. While it's clear, obviously, Edward saw this as a great thing. This is their chance. Because, as you rightly point out, power in Tudor England is very personal. It's based here on personal connections. Those associated with Anne Boleyn fell because of their personal association with her. Those personally associated with Jane Seymour will rise because of their connection to her. However she caught the eye of the king, by March 1536 at the latest, it is clear that his attachment or relationship with Jane Seymour is, he's taking it very, very seriously. Anne is on her way out. Everyone is sensing the changing of the guard. By the 18th of April, Edward and Anne have been moved into Cromwell's old apartments at Greenwich. So that, in fact, Cromwell is actually kicked out to make way for them, so he hadn't actually left them yet. In order that they could personally chaperone Henry's visits to Jane. He wanted to be seen to be courting her properly, so there could be no allegations of, adultery or that anything was not handled properly. So Edward certainly has sort of a front row seat to the developing relationship between the king and his sister. And it is clear that they certainly encouraged it. I think anyone would have been mad not to, with so much power sort of dangling in front of them. The most immediate consequence is that Edward is made Viscount Beauchamp just a few days after Henry and Anne's marriage is declared invalid. We also, another example of just how close they were to power is that Anne Stanhope travelled with Jane on the royal barge during a pageant held on the 17th of May, with Edward Seymour looking on. So they're very much at the sort of heart of power now. He's also, of course, immediately presented with large grants of land. He's got a lot of money. We know he's ordering brand new clothes. He's ordering his wife brand new clothes. he was definitely a man on the rise on his own merit, as we've seen. He was in the household of Wolsey. He's clearly speaking regularly with the king and in close proximity to him. But obviously his marriage to Jane, Henry's marriage to Jane, takes the whole thing up a notch.
It does seem to be the case that in those, I would say, early years of Henry's battle to produce an heir, that families were prepared to push daughters, whatever, towards, to make the family obviously bigger in that era. So it's understandable that he would do something like that. But obviously as time went on and towards the end of Henry's life, people were probably holding back from forcing people forward. They were probably, because they knew what he was like by that time. So they were just kind of thinking, no, we don't want to get involved with this guy.
Absolutely, yes. And through our eyes, I guess, we think, he's literally just sent one wife to the block. May 1536, he literally kills Anne Boleyn and everyone associated with her. So it seems so strange to us that a brother would not force, but at least push his sister sort of into that position. But I think we have to remember it's just all about power, really. Power, money, securing a future. Were Jane to have a son, of course, he would find himself uncle to the future king, which of course did happen. I'm pretty sure it doesn't play out the way he hoped, but still, he became the most powerful man in the kingdom. So, yeah. But again, you're absolutely right. By the end of his reign, I think the perception had shifted very much. There were not that many women ready to take a chance.
Except Catherine Parr.
Yeah, I'm not sure how willingly she did that. But
yeah, we'll never know, really, will we?
No.
I suppose relationships within powerful families could open doors, as we've just kind of mentioned. But they could just as easily lead to complications behind closed doors. Now, sometimes the quieter stories reveal just as much about ambition and control. Catherine Filiol was Edward's first wife, but she was quietly set aside. What's the story behind that?
Oh, this is quite a story. Catherine herself was born around the same time as Edward, probably sometime between 1500 and 1504. And she was the daughter of a local noble family. About 50 miles from Wolf Hall they lived, at a place called Woodlands. So she was intended as Edward's wife from a very early age. It was a great sort of local alliance. And she dutifully did marry Edward, and they seemed fairly happy. She went to live at Wolf Hall, which would have been usual. At this time, Edward they married actually just prior to him going to France in Mary Tudor's entourage. And she went to live with his family at Wolf Hall, and everything seems absolutely fine. She bears him a son. She was pregnant by 1526, 1527, and their first son is born about then. Sometime prior to 1527, Catherine and Edward quarrelled with her father, Sir William Filiol, who wrote a will disinheriting both Catherine and Edward, saying that they would inherit nothing from him, but he would leave Catherine an allowance of £40 if she would live virtuously and abide in some house of religion with other women. This is all very strange. We have no idea what the quarrel was, but although Edward and Catherine have quarrelled with her father, as yet there is no evidence that there's any quarrel between her and Edward. In fact, there's no evidence of marital discord at all. She goes on to bear another son, John. Nope. Edward, sorry, in 1529. But soon after that, Edward repudiates his wife, which was not an easy thing to do, as Henry VIII himself found out.
I mean, the way Catherine was removed from the picture suggests that there was obviously more going on beneath the surface, as you've kind of just talked about a little bit there. And when you start to look at the whispers and speculations surrounding her, things become even more complex. Now, there were also rumours Catherine had an affair with Edward's father. Is there any evidence, or was this a convenient excuse to remove her?
This wasn't even really a convenient excuse to remove her. This is a later invention. As far as we can tell, anyway, it's not until centuries later that there is a note in a margin of a book that claims that she had sexual relations with her father-in-law. But yes, that dates to Peter Helen in the 17th century. The idea, another source tells that Edward, when he was in France, learnt through sorcery or magic. Seriously, you cannot make this up. And he saw somehow that Catherine had been unfaithful to him. And that this was the basis of his discontent. Again, there is actually no contemporary evidence for this. That, again, comes from a later source. Again, in the 19th century, yet another antiquarian claimed that love letters between Catherine and her father-in-law and other men exist, but no trace of any of these have ever been found. In fact, there is no evidence that Catherine was unfaithful at all.
It's quite difficult, isn't it? Because we all know about the Tudor propaganda of the time, but as you've stated there, these so-called letters or whatever are from events maybe 100, 200 years into the future.
Yeah, and as we all know, any woman who doesn't conform to social norms or transgresses from the societal norm, or in fact does anything different whatsoever, is always blamed or vilified for that action. So that does appear to be what has happened here. She may have been unfaithful. There is no evidence either way. But it appears that later historians have looked for a reason, settled on one. She's an evil adulteress. We're running with this. And that's a story that persists just about exclusively everywhere to this day.
And generally, insinuations against anybody generally stuck because there was no way, especially at that time period. I mean, Anne Boleyn's a great example. They threw so much stuff at her and it all just stuck. And she had no way out. There was just no possible way that she was going to get away with what they were accusing her of.
No.
And I guess that's the same with Catherine Filial. I mean, stories like that often do swirl around powerful women, especially when politics are involved. But once the dust settled, her life took a different turn, one that's just as important, I guess, to understand. So what happened to her after the annulment? Did she just kind of fade into obscurity, or did she remain active in any way?
This is where trying to piece her story together becomes very difficult. First of all, again, linking into sort of later evidence, they suggest that there was a great scandal. Historians such as Alison Weir or Joanna Denny have suggested that there was a great scandal surrounding the Seymours at this time. But there doesn't actually, again, appear to be any evidence of this. And Henry VIII hated scandal, but there was no sort of absence of Edward from court. There is actually no record of this great scandal in the court records, but you'd think it would at least deserve a mention. So quite what happened is open to debate, really. And there are some options here. Catherine does go to a nunnery, but why she goes to a nunnery is completely unclear. One of the options is that she wanted to. I personally don't favour this theory, but it is possible that she had always had a desire to be a nun, and that because she was so unhappy, Edward consented. This was legally possible in the Tudor period, but there was a serious problem. It would have required Edward to remain celibate as long as his wife lived, and he is extremely unlikely to have agreed to that. The other option is that when she was sent away to a nunnery is that she was unwell. By sending her to a nunnery, she would have been sent to the best medical care available. If we think back to what historians now believe they know about Elizabeth Woodville, while traditionally it was thought she had been banished, because she was very inconvenient, there is no evidence to suggest that she was very sick, perhaps suffering from the plague or something like that, and so was in fact sent to the convent for the best medical care available. So again, that is another option. The third, and I always hesitate to sort of tentatively, because this is speculation as well, loosely based on the evidence, is that Catherine had been seduced, been unfaithful, or even been assaulted, and that she and Edward had agreed that it was best for her to retire to a nunnery, and that this would be the best way to move forward. It's not beyond the realms of possibility, and again, this lack of great scandal, to me, does suggest that perhaps they had reached some sort of cordial agreement, even if she had been unfaithful, and again, there's no evidence she had, that they felt this was the best option all round. There is no evidence whatsoever of familial discord between Edward and his father. So even if Catherine were to have been unfaithful or assaulted or anything of that kind, I think we can safely say John Seymour is going to be innocent of that accusation. There's also the idea that sending to a nunnery would have been a bad thing and an irrevocable break with her children. Again, this is not necessarily the case. I have spent a good deal of time trying to figure out where Catherine may have been sent. I can find no record of her anywhere. The most obvious places would have been a large nunnery such as Shaftesbury or Wilton, both of which were fairly local. But there's no evidence of her there. That's not to say she didn't go there. There's just to say the evidence doesn't exist. But she would have, in all likelihood, been able to live there in relative luxury. She did have money coming in. And by this point, we are no longer talking, generally speaking, we're no longer talking small cells, the sort of medieval monasteries or convents that might spring to mind. There are women at this point living in private cells, having private food, dressing differently, and she may well have been allowed to visit her sons as well. Generally, nunneries were not completely closed, so we cannot rule out that part of any agreement reached was that she would be able to still see her family and her sons. But again, there is simply no evidence for this, I'm afraid. Catherine vanishes, like many other women. We do know that she did not live particularly long, because, of course, Edward marries again, and he was not free to do so until her death. Again, There's some debate about that, because there is debate about the precise nature of their separation. But he doesn't remarry until she's dead, suggesting that he didn't feel he was free, or at least he morally didn't feel he should until after that.
So let's talk about Anne Seymour, formerly Stanhope. And for those that are not aware, on the date that we're actually recording this was the day she died in 1587. Now, one of the big questions about her is, how did Anne's relationship with her rival, Catherine Parr, affect her standing at court?
This is an interesting question, because Anne Stanhope, Catherine Parr famously called Anne Stanhope that hell, in a moment of what we have to imagine is frustration and fury. And that sort of epithet has stuck with Anne Stanhope ever since. But the idea that they were rivals right from the start, two very strong women engaged in a cat fight that lasted the best part of a couple of decades, not the case. They were actually once firm allies and friends. Anne Stanhope was present when Henry married Catherine Parr in 1544, and she served in the Queen's household. Anne Stanhope, I'm just going to use Stanhope here to set her aside from the other Seymours we might encounter, served every one of Henry VIII's queens to one extent or another, and emerged in one piece, which was quite impressive. But her and Catherine Parr were good friends. They were both highly educated women, and they were crucially reformists. They were even good enough that good enough friends that Catherine would try to do Anne favours, and vice versa. For example, Catherine tried to help Anne by asking the king if Edward could be sent back from the north, due to the fact Anne was unwell with one of her many, many pregnancies. They formed, along with other women, other educated women, such as Jane Dudley, Catherine Willoughby, etc., famously a learned circle of women that surrounded Catherine Parr. They would read books, read texts, educate themselves, and debate religion, all of which, of course, was taking place right on the edge of the law and what was actually permissible under Henry VIII. This made them a target for everyone who wanted to see Catherine Parr brought down. And this is where her survival depended on the loyalty of her women. When they did target the Queen, of course, they arrested Anne Askew, who there is evidence that she was part of, was supplying books, essentially, to the Queen's women. And there is the suggestion, there is a source from Anne Stanhope's nephew that claims that Anne actually sent Anne Askew money while she was in the Tower. And her nephew would later claim that both Anne's and Catherine Parr were active parts of this reformist network that was working to bring these texts and educational materials into the court via the Queen's household. Anne Askew, of course, famously refuses to implicate the Queen or any of her women, and dies for it. But yes, so Anne Stanhope and Catherine Parr, there's a very close relationship. They come through this scandal, all of the women come through this scandal by sticking together. And of course, Henry doesn't have the evidence, and Catherine Parr gets to Henry before anyone else does, and famously says, "Oh goodness, it's all been mistaken. I know nothing. I'm just a feeble woman." No doubt whilst crossing her fingers behind her back, and gets away with it.
Did you see the film Firebrand?
I did, yeah.
What did you think of it?
I thought it was very good. Inaccurate, of course, in some places, but then it is fiction. But I thought it was a good portrayal of the tension, I think, that was present in the court at this time. If Anne Askew, Anne Stanhope, for example, it was called Anne, did send money to Anne Askew. Had she been caught, she would have been killed. These are huge, high stakes people are playing for here, same as Catherine Parr. If Henry had believed she was guilty, she would have gone to the block. There is very little doubt about it. And I think the adaptation, as I say, while not 100% accurate, of course, did capture very well the sort of the high stakes these people were playing for, and the tension that would have existed in the court at that time.
It's a very dark portrayal, isn't it?
It
very
is,
dark.
yeah.
And apart from the ending, which of course I never talk about, I have mentioned this before, but the ending is a little bit, well, you've got to go and watch it, haven't you, really, to understand what it's all about. Life, after such a dramatic turning point, can take many unexpected turns. And it's interesting to see how people reposition themselves in shifting political circles. Now, personal dynamics at court could play a huge role in that, especially when it came to navigating relationships with others close to the crown. What can Anne Stanhope tell us about the power and limits of noblewomen in Tudor England?
That there weren't really any limits. Anne Stanhope was a fiercely ambitious woman, and fiercely passionate about what she believed in. She was highly educated. She employs tutors. She employs tutors. She writes to people on the continent. She educates her children, especially her daughters, unusually, to an extremely high standard. A couple of her daughters become some of the first English women to ever publish their work. She rises, of course, to become the most powerful woman in England under Edward VI. Just quickly dashing back to the last question, this is where her relationship with Catherine Parr does start to fall apart. To go over it very briefly, Catherine, of course, remarries very quickly to Thomas Seymour, Edward's brother. There's a lot of scandal and people feel that this was not quite the thing that should have been done. Anne Stanhope doesn't entirely approve, and Catherine rather takes exception to this. Obviously, Catherine is also used to being the First Lady in the kingdom. This is now a position that Anne sort of begins to move into. Their real argument comes when Princess Elizabeth is placed in Catherine and Thomas's household, and Anne gets word of the goings-on there. In particular, of course, there are the conduct of Thomas Seymour towards Elizabeth, and she chastises Catherine for allowing this. And I think it was a sharp rebuke, I think is the term, and Catherine doesn't take particularly kindly to that. However, their friendship, while it's clearly soured, as I say, Catherine is at this point that Catherine calls Anne that hell, the epithet that has stuck to her ever since. Both women are pregnant in 1548 at the same time. And for Anne, this is probably about her billionth pregnancy, and she gives birth safely. Catherine, of course, doesn't. This is her first pregnancy, and she dies giving birth to her daughter Mary, who is immediately taken into Anne Stanhope's care. She immediately steps in and takes charge of the infant, which was not Catherine's wish, but at the time there were no other arrangements in place. But yes, going back to the power and limits for noble in Tudor England, I would argue that Anne Stanhope shows that there weren't really many. her and Edward were a partnership, a power couple, very much in the way that we would understand it today. There is evidence of affection between them, and famously writes to Thomas Wriothesley, saying, Edward hasn't written to me, I'm worried sick. Get him to at least dash down a quick note, basically, while he was away in Scotland. And dutifully, of course, that's what Edward does, and he writes back apologising for having worried her. So there is evidence for affection, but primarily, where I'm assuming affection grew, but this was a political alliance. Two very ambitious, very powerful, well-educated people who are making their way at the Tudor court and are determined to do the best they can for themselves and for their children. You only have to look at drawings of the old Tudor palace at Somerset House and the plans for that to know just how high they were aspiring. These are buildings to rival any monarch's palace, or at least it would have been if it had been fully realised.
I think the women, particularly in that period of time, had to have a certain amount of strength and an appetite to back that up in certain circumstances, because they were really under pressure, weren't they, a lot of the time?
They were. And for Anne Stanhope, her sort of faith and her reformist views were very much at the centre of who she was. She educates herself, she educates her daughters. She has dozens of works dedicated to her, which shows both how far-reaching sort of she was in that respect and the regard with which others held her. Because obviously if they wanted favours or to gain favour, they knew the power that she might wield with her husband. So they were dedicating all these works to her, both on her own merit and because of the power she was thought to have.
So looking at Anne Stanhope, it does give us a real sense of how noble women navigated influence and expectation in a world dominated by, I suppose, shifting loyalties. But her story becomes even more layered when we consider the relationships that she built or endured with other powerful women at court. Anne had complex ties with two powerful women, Lady Mary, the future Mary I, and Jane Dudley, Duchess of Northumberland. How did these relationships shape her position during Edward VI's reign and, of course, after her husband's fall?
If we look at Jane Dudley first, her and Jane were part of the circle around Catherine Parr, and they remained good friends. Eventually, they would broker a marriage alliance between their children. But one of the most telling incidents, I think, regarding their relationship is where Edward Seymour is sent to the Tower for the first time, and Anne is lobbying for his release. She goes straight to Jane Dudley, and essentially they hatch a plan to get him out and to soften. We'll use Northumberland, who was John Dudley, so Jane Dudley's husband, and bring him round to the idea that he should release Edward Seymour. The two men had once been great friends and allies, but the relationship had somewhat soured. Once Edward became Lord Protector, Dudley essentially thought he'd become too powerful. And they hatch a plot, essentially. And Anne flings herself to the floor in front of Dudley, begging him to release her husband, reminding him of the friendship that had been between them. Again, in rather a display of female submission. Dudley is horrified and embarrassed. He quickly says, "Oh my goodness, get up. It'll all be fine. And then Anne and Jane carefully present to him their idea, and he agrees. So I think that is it always makes me smile, that, because it really is the perfect example of women just plotting to get their own way and manipulating in order to do it. Just how seriously Northumberland takes this is that when Edward Seymour is arrested for the second time and sent to the Tower, he ensures that Anne Stanhope is arrested at exactly the same time. So she has no chance of reaching his wife or himself and doing precisely what they did before. But again, I think that is a great example of just how much he actually feared the power she had, and he did not want to face another deputation by her and his wife, which I think is, I always find that quite amusing, but yeah, in real terms, it is clear that Dudley did fear the power that she had. I think if I just quickly go back to mention Lady Mary, because I would suggest that her relationship with Lady Mary, Anne Stanhope's, was probably the most important of her life. They met while she was a maid-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, and their friendship endured their entire life. Mary called Anne Stanhope my good Nan or my good gossip. They exchanged gifts, letters, Mary was godmother to several of Anne's children. But just quickly, I think the most important thing about this relationship is that they never allowed matters of faith to come in between them. In fact, Anne of Mary's first acts as queen is to release Anne Stanhope from the Tower. She releases her at the same time as she sanctions Bishop Gardiner's release. That is how important and how much value she places on her friendship. And she does immediately restore her to her position as Duchess of Somerset, allows her to live at Sion House in the manner to which she's become accustomed. And of course, Anne goes on to prosper under both Mary and Elizabeth, ends up buried in Westminster Abbey on Elizabeth's orders. So it's sort of the only way is up for Anne, despite losing poor Edward Seymour.
I guess relationships at court, as you've just mentioned there, can actually make or break a woman's standing, especially in such a volatile political landscape. But when we step back, I guess, and look at the bigger picture, there's a deeper story about how women navigated, and were often caught in the shifting tides of power. Looking at the face of Catherine and Anne, what does their story tell us about how women were used or erased in Tudor power struggles?
I think certainly they are erased to serve the ends of both people at the time and later historians. It did not serve anyone to broadcast the power that Anne Stanhope wielded or the reality of her situation. So she was cast as the devil incarnate. She manipulates Jane Seymour so she catches the eye of Henry VIII. She manipulates her husband so that he sends his own brother to the block. She stands by while her husband goes to his death. None of this, of course, is really true. As soon as you scratch the surface, the reality of who Anne Stanhope was has almost been deliberately erased ever since. If you look at, actually, if you go all the way up to sort of the Tudors and things, the television show, Anne Stanhope does not come out of that well either. Because it doesn't serve anyone's purpose, really. To look into the minute details of her life, her learning, her patronage of scholars, her books. It's much more fun to cast her as the great, femme fatale, the devil that the Tudors cast her as. Even in Edward's own lifetime, they were saying, "Oh, if it wasn't for Anne, you would have been fine." Very much not the case, obviously.
Do you think she just had, looking at it from today, was she kind of a bit part character then, do you think, in that whole massive scenario of the Tudor period?
No, I think she was a huge character and incredibly important. You can, as I said, you can trace her through serving all the wives of Henry VIII. You see her at her husband's side. She later goes on to, as I said, prosper under Mary. with whom she was great friends. She prospers under Elizabeth, who visits her personally. I don't think she was a bit part player at all. And some of the accusations levelled at her could certainly there's a little bit of basis in truth, but by caricaturing her as that hell, it's easy to dismiss her. So you can write her off and move on to someone more interesting, which is the fate of most women throughout history, really.
Yeah.
They can be written off so that you can focus on the study of Edward Seymour. And when Edward Seymour makes a mistake, we'll just blame his wife. We won't look into the details of his life, his education, who he was. We can just blame Anne for that. That happens a lot in biographies of Edward Seymour.
I think you're right, yeah, and I think it's a fascinating story, and we could probably talk about it for another hour, but for the time being, it's now time to talk about Rebecca. So, where can people find out more about you and information about you? And are there any social media sites you'd like to share?
Probably the best one to go for would be the Tudor Notebook, which is a Substack page I have with Amy McElroy. I say we. I think I've written about 3 posts. Amy is very much the primary author and the technological genius behind it. I just turn up and write a post every now and then and try to offer support. On Instagram, which is probably the social media I'm most active on, I'm Damaged by Books. That's the handle for my account there.
I'll say it again. How did you become Damaged by Books? Why did you pick that as a handle?
Oh, it's sort of a play on a sort of a Jane Austen quote where they said, if you read too many novels, you'll become damaged by books. Essentially, women's minds will be corrupted if they read too much.
Might be right as well. So, thank you, Rebecca, for joining me this week and sharing the story of Edward Seymour and his tumultuous relationships in the Tudor era. It's clear that your depth of knowledge and engaging storytelling brought a complex figure to life and, of course, the women as well. And I know that our listeners will have really enjoyed it. So it was a pleasure to have you on the show. So thank you again for taking the time to be here today.
Thank you so much.
And as always, to everyone who's tuned in today, thank you so much. This, sadly, is the last in the present series of History Speaks, but I'm hoping to be back later in the year, so stay tuned. If you've enjoyed our chats, and if you love history, of course you'll love History Roadshow. So don't forget to like, which is one of these, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you never miss any of our historical stories. So until next time, keep exploring the past with us, and we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.